know that I write these talks, and I go over them, and by the end of several hours of working on them, I stop writing them, and I always want them to be making sense, and really I do, and sometimes I have to add a preface, and so today I'm adding a preface that just simply gives you the outline, the umbrella, the arc of this talk. Is that I want to let you know that what I'm really trying to do today is start an exploration of how Unitarian Universalism and religious liberalism in general can offer responses to the challenges that we face during the pandemic. That's the preface, okay? And the way I figured out how to say that some of those things is, of course, for me, it starts with a story. So I've realized that whenever I'm in the Hancock Food Co-op, there is likely a forester in there with me. I used to describe this kind of phenomenon by saying, you can't throw a rock in such and such a place without hitting a so-and-so. But because I'm tightening up my language, I'll say today that you can't lovingly lob a Brussels sprout in the co-op without landing on a forester. So I was talking with a forester in the co-op the other day, and we were talking about wildfires. As we paused in front of that stack of olive tubs in that one aisleway there, he introduced me to the concept of ecological disturbance. He described that in ecology, a disturbance is a temporary change in environmental conditions that causes a pronounced change in an ecosystem. Disturbances often act quickly and with great effect. They alter the physical structure or the arrangement of living and physical elements. So a good example that he brought up of this role of disturbance was the example he shared of the ponderosa pine forests in Western United States, where we know that wildfires move through those forests on a threateningly regular basis. But what those wildfires do is they actually thin existing vegetation, allowing for new growth. If those fires are suppressed, it's this other kind of tree, the Douglas fir, that is a shade-tolerant kind of species that eventually replaces the pines. Now, Douglas firs apparently have these dense crowns that limit the amount of sunlight reaching the forest floor. So without sufficient light, new growth is severely limited. And as the diversity of surface plants decreases, animal species that rely on them diminish as well. Fire, the disturbance in this case, is important not only to the species directly affected by the burning, but also to the many other organisms whose survival depends on an environment liberated by fire. Now, a wildfire that opens up the canopy creates new, more diverse growth of trees and plants and the attendant animal species that forage on that growth. Now, I was struck by the idea of disturbance being understood from my broad perspective, that disturbance yields a new healthy reality. I told my forester buddy that I wanted to share some about ecological disturbance with you, and he kind of gave me a half smile and a half frown as he responded, well, Paul, I think most of your UU folks probably already understand the essentials of ecological disturbance. Look, I have no doubt that I couldn't lovingly lob a Brussels sprout in one of our in-person services without hitting a forester or some equally sophisticated ecology-related thinker. Partly because of that, I don't want to get too scientifically detailed with the presentation of ecological disturbance, but its concepts were attractive to me because as individuals, as a congregation, as a local community, as a state, as a nation, as a world, we are in the middle of a disturbance. Clearly, the pandemic is a temporary change in environmental conditions that is causing pronounced change in our ecosystem. And as I waited in line at the co-op, I was visualizing the ecology of disturbance as this kind of lattice, that lattice of thought that undergirds a scientific response to disturbance. It helped me make sense out of the totality of the experience of ecological disturbance, from the disruption to new life. And I left the store kind of relieved by science in a way that this neophyte to science had never felt before. And let me be clear, there may be some out there today who want to talk about virology and the rest of the hard science of the pandemic. I'm not going there. And I'm definitely not going to draw parallels between the effects of wildfire and the effects of the pandemic. It's not happening. That's because the ecosystem I want to talk about is made up of our head, our heart, and I think our very souls. And the shape of the disturbance the pandemic creates in that ecosystem is found in the feelings of depression, sadness, anxiety, and grief. I know why I was tuned into the forester's thoughts and why I immediately jumped to think of the disturbance in the ecosystem of our head, heart, and souls. It was because before I went to the co-op that day, I had been asked by a member of our congregation, Paul, what can we as a congregation do about grief? She said she was wondering what we could do to support people in their grieving. You may, after 2.5 or so years, you may recognize that I am, generally speaking, a solutions kind of guy. I was determined to find the answer to her question when I was exposed to that lattice of thought that undergirded science's response to ecological disturbance. I admit I was kind of dizzied in the store by the recognition that there is a lattice of thought that undergirds our response to depression, sadness, anxiety, and grief. Our religiously liberal lattice is woven in the core elements of our faith. You've heard me refer often to the tenets of our religious liberal legacy. Among those tenets is what's known as the fifth tenet, and it is most often stated something like this. Liberalism holds that the necessary resources, both human and divine, you define divine, liberalism holds that the necessary resources, both human and divine, are available for the achievement of meaningful change and justify an attitude of optimism. Real quickly again. Liberalism holds that the necessary resources, both human and divine, are available for the achievement of meaningful change and justify an attitude of ultimate optimism. Just as science takes a broad view of disturbance, our faith offers a broad view on the disturbance in our individual and collective lives. It's optimism that the resources to make meaningful change are available to us right now, right here in our lives. This is the making of an attitude of heaven on earth. And it is not simple Pollyannaism. Our faith doesn't urge you to play the glad game where you join Pollyanna and find something to be glad about in every situation. But it underpins our challenges with resolve that there are resources available to make meaningful change. The fact is, in the short term, we're likely at times to feel defeated by our circumstances. I've been with you all for the past year, and I know it feels to some of us like we've gotten our butts kicked. Standing in that checkout line, I was thinking I at least have a response to offer to that congregant who asked what we as a congregation do to support people in their grieving. I think we start with believing there are sufficient resources to achieve meaningful change. We are a faith of optimism or hope. We carry with ourselves that prophetic sense of our role in history and envision a world as it could be, and we act to make it so. We work to shape history rather than feel merely pushed around by it. We believe we are resourceful in justice issues, and we need to remember we are also resourceful in our response to individual and collective disturbance. In challenging times, the first exercise of our resource is found in gathering together. Unitarian minister William Ellery Channing in 1830 wrote, "The value of associations is to be measured by the energy, the freedom, the activity, the moral power which they encourage and diffuse." Channing framed a creative principle of association that stated that coming together is a great releaser of energy. Coming together, Channing said, calls forth new forces and gives our minds a consciousness of powers which would otherwise have been unknown. Now, Channing wasn't specifically talking about depression or sadness or anxiety or grief, but I think that his 200-year-old thoughts on the power of our coming together lifts up a way for our faith and our congregation to support people with their grief. In our coming together today, we provide each other with specific practical resources. I'm thinking now of the smaller groups, those intimate associations we've formed or expanded during the past year. The newly formed women's group decided during the pandemic to gather twice a month. The men's group has stayed active each month throughout the pandemic. We added a midweek Wednesday night service specifically to give ourselves another chance to be together during trouble-filled weeks. The Monday and Wednesday gratitude groups continue to meet every other week, and the long-standing coffee clatch brings folks together every Friday. We've got a new book group and the potential of an upcoming empathy circle. And heck, even this moment, our interactive online Sunday services have enabled us to extend our gathering to friends far away. Each of these are examples of resources available to us to make meaningful change in our lives in the midst of the pandemic. Some may call that being resilient, and frankly, I think it is. For me, my understanding of the source of our resilience, and I think it is in kind a response to that caring question from the congregant, is that our resilience starts with our faith that meaningful change can be made in our lives. Reinforcing that aspirational tenet is done through our gathering together and making real those resources we hope for. I know it sometimes feels like we're getting our butts kicked, but thanks to a forester in the co-op, I've been reminded that our faith weaves a lattice of thought and hope, supporting us, reinforcing that we're going to make it through together. Thank you.